thank you once again for inviting me. Thank you for organization of this very interesting event. And I will start with my topic, which is the Great Synagogue of Vilnius: Architecture, Meaning, and Memory. I'm an art historian and an architect, also mainly working as a landscape architect. So I'll dwell also a little bit on possibilities of inscribing the future solution into the townscape of Vilnius as a modern city. So let's start with the analysis of what was the Great Synagogue of Vilnius in terms of architectural history. And I'll look at this edifice, this building, from mainly 2 points. The first point is the architectural typology, which type of building, of structure, of space was this? And the second viewpoint is more practical and usual in art history, but I'll use an architectural iconography to analyze what did this type of architecture mean in the eyes of the contemporaries and the beholders in later times. So you can see that the interior space of the prayer hall, which is the core of every synagogue, was a space spanned by masonry vaults supported by 4 columns close to the center of these vaults. And of course, they were framing the centrally located bima, which is typical for the Ashkenazi Jewry in these lands. So let's go on and try to understand where this scheme comes from. So let's see it, let's go out of the box and see it in the context of the European architecture. The first known example of 4-pier synagogue is far removed from here in time and in space. It's a synagogue in Tamar, and every researcher of architecture, also in classical works by Karol Krinsky, says that there is very, very little chance of this synagogue serving an example for Eastern synagogues, Eastern European synagogues, where a similar scheme became popular in the 16th and 17th and further centuries. So we should to look for closer sources for this architectural solution. The earliest known synagogues of a similar scheme are called now after Pichotka and Pichotka, Michal Kazimierz and Maria Pichotka, who called this type bima support synagogues, which appear in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in late 16th century. The earliest known and properly documented synagogue was the old synagogue in Przemysl, built in 1592, probably by architect Andrea Pellegrino Bononi, who came from Italy, and he was a guild builder, master builder from Lvov, Lemberg, if you wish. And it was a very, very interesting building. You see here these 4 piers, columns, standing close to the bima. They are pretty fat and low, and still they are decorated with Corinthian capitals. That means that this Corinthian order was used, it was an intention of the architect to produce, to show the decorum of this edifice as a very important and sacred, holy building. That is, that the order of the building, which should have been Doric or Tuscan, was replaced with this high Corinthian, highly decorative order. So, and this structure around the bima supports a superstructure, which, say, cubic superstructure that bears 4 barrel vaults on the perimeter of the prayer hall. In the terms of construction, this is a scheme borrowed from ecclesial architecture, not only of that time. If you would look at the Bernardine nuns monastery in Lviv, you can see this hall of the refectory, which is where the vaulting is supported by a single square column, and you have 4 barrel vaults on the perimeter. Of course, in the synagogue you have 4 columns, and this central cubic space is divided to put the bima in. And this is a very popular solution in Gothic architecture. Here you have an example in Gothic style in Wawel Castle. Also in Moscow, where the Italian architects worked in Kremlin, they used this scheme for this palace of facets to produce a huge space, because you do not need a large span of the walls. You can support them in the middle. This is the logic of an engineer. But let's return to the decorum, to the decoration, to the order. In Renaissance art, we see that there is a tendency to show Jewish architecture, the architecture of the temple, of the Jewish temple, with orders of low decorum, say Doric, Tuscan. And when an artist wants to depict the triumphant church, meaning the temple of the future, the true church, he uses the Corinthian or composite order to show that it is more important and more ornate than the Jewish temple. And we see as this principle is used also for depiction of the Jewish temple as an exotic edifice which serves the Hebrews in ancient times. This is one of the frescoes of the stanzas in Vaticano. So here you see the temple as a Corinthian structure that also corresponds to the description by Flavius Josephus. And when we look at the first earliest synagogues of this type with bima support, we can find capitals which are close to Corinthian order. That means, in my opinion, that the architects, who definitely were Christian, because Jews couldn't be members of the Masons guilds, they would like to show a synagogue as a replacement, as a replica, as a, some remez, as they say in Hebrew, some allusion to the temple, but in positive terms, not downplaying the decoration to the Doric or Tuscan order. And this way we come to the earliest synagogue in Volhynia, where this type moves from Ruthenia in 1920s. Here is the great synagogue, or old synagogue in Lutsk, where we have a combination of octagonal piers and heavy superstructure supporting barrel walls. From this moment, this scheme started penetrating also the lands of the Duchy of Lithuania. Here I mean Belarusia, and we have there a group of synagogues that were built in 1640s, but of course before Khmelnytsky's uprising. They are very, very, very similar to each other, and they are typical and include these octagonal piers and 1-2-tier superstructure supporting in the center the vaulting. And there is a doctoral work by Maria Grobman who shows that this architecture is dependent on the local ecclesial architecture of Belarusia. There are other theories explaining what is the meaning of this central structure framing the bima. One of the points of view belongs to Szymon Zajíc, who wrote before the Second World War that there is an inscription on such a bima in Tekochin, and it's written there, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and is safe. Meaning that it is a quotation, it is a transposition of biblical verse into architecture. That is possible, but this inscription is of later times, and we actually do not know what did the architect who built a synagogue in Przemysl think about his concept. And these are other synagogues of that period, which last well into the 18th century. So, but simultaneously with this type, with bima support synagogues or center clustered bima, as Skrinsky calls it, develops another type which is called nine-bay synagogue, where the vaulting of the central hall is divided into 9 bays of walls, which are supported by four columns which are not standing close to each other, and there is much more space around bima, and acoustics in these synagogues, which was much better. The series of these synagogues were started almost simultaneously in 1620s in Lviv and Ostrog, and the ground plans of these synagogues are very close to each other, and also the architectural details are almost identical. So most possibly it is one architect who produced these two synagogues, and comparing the records of architects working in Volhynia and in Lvov, I suppose that this could be Giacomo Modleni, who could build both synagogues. The synagogue in Ostrog survived. The synagogue in Lviv was razed during the war, and it is a very, very massive building with slanting buttresses. Not all of them have been built, but we can see in one of new photographs, the building is under the conservation, that such buttresses were planned. You see between the windows there is a relieving arch that preserves a possibility of inserting there an additional buttress. So what is the idea of this synagogue? My idea is that it was influenced by a Catholic Jesuit reconstruction of the temple, a book by Juan Bautista Villalpando and Juan Prado. It is a commentary to Prophet Ezekiel, where the ground plan of the temple is described as a 9-bay scheme. It shows it as a cosmic scheme with particular locations of tribes of Israel, of planets which were known in that time. And also it shows slanting and curved buttresses as an element of the temple. Also, Villalpando reconstructs the order of the temple as something having Corinthian capitals and Doric elements above them, which is an inverse use of orders in terms of architectural history of that time. And if we go back for a while to those capitals in Ostrog and Lviv, we see that Doric echinus is used above the canthus leaves of the Corinthian capital. So indeed, it is a quotation of Villalpando, to say nothing about the ground plan, which is a 9-bay ground plan. So this idea was later used in Holland, and here this story is much, much better known because everything was recorded and published, and they have books on everything and so on. But that happened later in 1670s, actually. But if we return here to Vilnius, we'll start talking about Vilnius. Finally, I found some time. So you can see that It is a combination of two previously explained types. One type is the Bima support synagogue, because the columns were standing close to each other. And another feature is that these columns do not have this heavy superstructure. They, with the help of some small additions and elevated center of the vault, arrive to the level of the general hall, which spans the whole space. So it is a very, very specific combination. It has no Corinthian details, because probably the synagogue is far removed in geography from the sources which are in Ruthenia and in Volhynia and in Lvov and Przemysl and Lutsk. So the architect builds Tuscan synagogues which correspond to the proportions of these synagogues. And this is the vaulting, as you know. And actually, it was a very, very interesting, let's say, genius solution, because the size of this hall was enormous. It was larger than Lviv, and it was larger than Ostrog, which are known to be huge, huge, great synagogues. But actually, this synagogue of Vilnius was not very influential in the world of Jewish architecture. I know only one synagogue in Druja, built in the 18th century, that continues or uses this solution. So, how do we know? How do we know that this Vilelpandan iconography was imbued into these structures? If we look at the drawing by Franciszek Smuglewicz of the late 18th century, we see how he treats the details of this synagogue. Look at the bima. You see, actually, it was pretty low, some 3-4 steps, and he shows the platform elevated with a long flight of steps. It's a detail borrowed from Vilelpanda's reconstruction of the temple in its different versions, with podest or without it, doesn't matter. But it is a depiction of the altar, incense altar of the temple. And if you would look at the light superstructure of the bima, you can see that these voluted buttresses are actually quotations from Vilelpando. They are buttresses of the temple, but not any decorative element. This is what saw artists in the 18th century. Of course, this doesn't mean that the builder saw in these eyes his product, but it's possible that this reading is quite possible. The architect or architects at the first instance of this type saw a replica of the temple in their work. But also, if we look at the pre-war photographs of the synagogue, we see the murals and these columns that were painted on top or above, on the Tuscan pilasters. And these columns were Corinthian, because an architect, the painter understood that the decorum of this building should be different. It is a decorum of the temple and not of a synagogue. So I will probably say a few words that it was not only a monument of architecture, it was also a place of memory. There are legends that give particular meanings, not meanings of the temple, but still of a holy space. But you probably have heard today, and you will hear more about this particular legends. Also, the construction date of the synagogue was moved in history back, always to the past, and it's very typical of producing a place of memory. Like in Lutsk, they say it couldn't be a synagogue, it's the palace, the low castle of Gediminas, and so on and so forth. And of course, this was, as a place of memory, as an important monument, it was used for producing decorum for presence, not for the past, just in visits of official persons of the Polish Republic. And also Chagall was painting here this interior as a recognized modern artist, but he did it mostly realistic, and it gives also borrows some glory from a synagogue and lends some glory of the artist to the synagogue in our eyes. But it was ruined, as you know, and it ceased to be a monument. It became a place of memory alone. So what could be done? Just few words, like John had shown a very, very broad perspective. I would like also to show a few examples as a landscape architect, let's say. What could be done to a synagogue? Let's say synagogue in Worms, it was totally ruined and totally rebuilt. It's very beautiful, but it's very problematic. It is an attempt to come on terms with history. That is impossible. There is a tragedy in the story of destruction, and we cannot produce an architectural statement that would say nothing happened. It is as it used to be. Let's go on. That's it. It's possible when a synagogue was built in the times of crusades, and it's, you know, this doesn't pain, doesn't hurt, doesn't pain, but to do something similar to something that was destroyed during the Holocaust, and we, the Jews, that in the first, the second, or the third generation still experience that tragedy, I think it would be a little bit not in the place. And another approach, well, sorry for stealing, but also if you are using a combination of destroyed but conserved and something that you add new, then even the very contrast between these two elements, I believe, produces a kind of tragedy that you would like, or an architect would like, to convey to the beholders. And there is another extremity, like a work done by Dani Karavan in Regensburg, where you reconstruct, but it's very fine. Let's say it's very smooth. It's all new, as if nothing has happened. I have some problem, but you should remember that this synagogue was destroyed in the 15th century, and it's an old story. It doesn't hurt to anybody present, I believe. And also here is another transitional solution in Lviv, where the Bet Midrash is done in linear tracing, let's say, but the ruins of the Golden Rose Synagogue is preserved as a ruin, mostly, just covered with some roofs, small roofs, sheds, which give an opportunity to the building to survive in our climate. So let's finish. Thank you very much. Thank you.